who had jobs and worked outside of the home but had no real, until you got married, you didn't go get an apartment kind of thing. Now, the children in the Warner homes, some had parents. Most had parents that couldn't take care of them, either financially or emotionally or physically. They couldn't take care of them. There were very few who had dead parents, who had no one to take care of them. There were very few who had parents that lived in another place. Now, my brother and I, we had one parent who lived in St. Albans City. My father always lived in St. Albans. My mother lived in Massachusetts.
She'd gone by then?
She had gone. Actually, I found out in years to come that they were divorced in 45. In 1946, my mother was in Massachusetts. She spent only 1 year. That 1 year that she was here and on her own, she was with that dress shop. And there was a time that she worked for King's Daughters Home, home for the elderly. She worked there too. She might have had 2 jobs at one time. I don't know what years she did work there. Anyway, I take that back. That's a mistake. They did not go to Massachusetts in 46. They did not go to Massachusetts until 1950. I was 10.
But had she met Fred?
Yes,
Better?
she had met Fred. Fred had just gotten out of the service, and she met him, she said, at a bar one night, at some bar that she worked. And he was from Richford, and he was selling farm machinery for Hazard. And he was a really crackpot salesman and was making great money. He would go and sell machinery to the farmers. And he had been married, but he married in his family it was believed, their religion, that if an older brother died and left a widow, that if there was a son available, the son should take over the widow's family. And that was the situation he had gotten himself into, and went off to fight in World War II. And when he came back, he knew 2 years. And when he came back, he knew this was stupid, because she had a right to some kind of a life herself. And she was raising the boys, and he paid for the support of her boys and helped her. But there was no marriage. When he came back from the service, there was no way that she was receptive to having him. She liked his money that he had been sending her. And he thought they should be married. And she never went along with that. They did get married, apparently. But 2 weeks, it's one of those, he never considered it a marriage. And she never made any claim on him as for support for the boys, because they are her boys, his boys anyway. But anyway, Fred and Mother, I think they lived together. Where they lived together, I'm not sure, because she was working in the dress shop, and I know they had a camp at Lake Carmel, because we have camp pictures of them then. And his relatives were from Richmond, and he had 2 brothers who were in the construction business in Massachusetts, building houses. And why he left his lucrative position with Hazard, I don't know.
And one of those brothers was Uncle Merriman?
Yes, and Uncle Charles. And so he left to go to Massachusetts, and my mother went with him. And they built the house, and that's where they lived. Better business. Anyway, when we went to the Warner home, my mother became a more regular visitor. but she was living in Massachusetts, and she would write letters, and she would spend winters, part of the winter in Florida. And when she would come to visit the winter home, she had a very dear friend, Mrs. Ellis, in St. Albans, Mr. and Mrs. Ellis. Now, what was her first name? Margaret. Margaret and Mr. Ellis were probably 20 years difference in age between husband and wife. And her first connection with Mr. Ellis was she was my mother's friend, and she got a job taking care of Mr. Ellis's house. His wife died, and Mr. Ellis probably was 60 some odd years old, and Mrs. Ellis is probably late 30s, early 40s. Old maid. And she got a job taking care of his house. Well, that grew into a stronger relationship between the two, and they eventually married. Well, when I met Mrs. Ellis and Mr. Ellis, they lived above the bakery in St. Albans, Brannigan's. They lived up there where John and Tracy lived a while, up in those apartments.
Nearby where the hotel is.
Yep, yep. And Mrs. Ellis and Mr. Ellis lived there, and the first time I met Mrs. Ellis was when I was in the Warner home, and my mother taxied us, sent a taxi, picked us up, came to Mr. and Mrs. Ellis's, and from that time, anytime my mother came to visit, we met at Mr. and Mrs. Ellis's. And it also gave my brother and I a place to go, that we could go and visit. We could walk downtown and visit with Mr. and Mrs. Ellis. He was an old man by then. He was nearly blind, but he loved to listen to us talk about things that were going on in our lives, school things and everything. We used to sing and dance for him and everything. He was a wonderful old man, and he just sit in his chair and loved to see us come. Mrs. Ellis said, can't think of it right now. Fred and Mom, Mr. and Mrs. Ellis. Mrs. Ellis used to make us fancy stuff, special cookies. She treated us really well. I mean, this winter she called me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I hadn't heard out of the blue. She said, I bet you can't guess what this is. And I said, I bet you I can. And I hadn't heard from her, and I don't know why she called me. She had seen something in the paper, your father's picture or something. She thought it was crazy about your father. That's where I stayed after I left McGinn's, because I had no place to stay. I stayed with her until I got married and moved in with your father in Burlington. And the night before I got married, she sat up half the night with me waiting for my mother to arrive from Massachusetts. My mother was bringing the wedding cake. She'd sit right up with me. She would love to play cards too. Anyway, so we could go and visit Mrs. Ellis. Now we never went in Fred's car. Never, ever. He might be there visiting. We never went in his car. I asked him about that years later, and he said, because I never wanted to come to cause any trouble between your mother and your father. My mother explained to me that they had joint custody. Not one of them was in total possession of. They had equal visiting rights. And my father couldn't say no, my mother couldn't do that. Yeah, Fred said no. My mother said that she would want to do a lot more thing with us. And my father said, and Fred's always said, no, first of all, I didn't like kids. Didn't want their messy bodies in his car. But he also said that he didn't want to ever cause any, never wanted to ever have to face my father with anything. Okay, he had no respect for my father.